This presentation is part of the series Capitalism Hits Home. It covers intersections of capitalist life with personal life in the United States. This particular podcast is on the Holy Fathers. It explores the Catholic Church's 2,000-year history of child sex abuse. It asks why this happened, and also, why is it now exposed after 2,000 years? The podcast is available at Democracy at Work's website and also at my website, HarrietFraad.com, HarrietFraad.com. The global Catholic Church is confronting an extraordinary crisis, a crisis not paralleled since the 1500s, the Reformation, which began with many sharp criticisms of Catholic Church corruption, and ended with a schism out of which Protestantism and the Protestant Church emerged and was established. Today, sexual abuse allegations against priests are surging in a startling array of nations. The United States, Canada, Germany, New Zealand, Australia, France, Italy, Austria, the Netherlands, Ireland, Switzerland, Belgium, Bolivia, Mexico, Brazil, and Chile, to name some of the dominant ones. New abuse scandals emerge daily. The John Jay School of Criminal Justice in New York estimates that in the U.S. alone, between 1950 and 2002, hundreds of thousands of children have been sexually abused by Catholic clergy. By the way, if any of you want the stats or the sources, you can get in touch with me and I'll give them to you. The abuse numbers mount as the investigations continue. In 2018, just one of the 50 U.S. states, Pennsylvania, did an in-depth investigation. They found that over 1,000 children were abused by at least 300 priests who were known to the church as abusers and who maintained their positions and their free access to children. In fact, the Catholic Church has a 2,000-year history of sex abuse. In their acclaimed and really good book, Sex, Priests, and Secret Codes, Father Thomas Doyle, with former monks Richard Sipes and Patrick Whale, used their own documents to confirm the Church's 2,000-year problem with clerical sex abuse, a non-addressed problem, by the way. Why has the Church been plagued by so much pedophilia, predominantly homosexual? And why has the scandal regarding that situation only erupted in 2002, 16 years ago, when it's been going on for 2,000 years? As to the first question, the sheer extent of homosexual pedophilic abuse within the Church prompts my speculation that an extremely patriarchal institution, combined with an all-male hierarchy's repudiation of women as equal partners in church leadership and governance, maybe engenders a homoerotic internal culture that attracts homosexual men to the priesthood. This factor certainly is true among nuns who have such a problem with lesbianism that they now have a rule you're not allowed to have any special friends in the convent, because not every person wants to live only with some home with a total same-sex population. However, those factors alone don't explain the predominance of homosexual pedophilia. After all, not all nuns are lesbians, and they are not pedophiles, even though it seems from the study Lesbian Nuns Breaking Silence that most nuns are lesbians. They're not pedophiles. A therapist who treats abuser priests, Leslie Lothstein, gives another explanation. She implicates the sexual immaturity of priests who enter the seminary often as young as 13 and 14 miss a critical passage of maturation and sexual maturation, which begins to be forbidden in seminaries, even though seminarians are often molested by their priest teachers. The first time sexual experimentation that's accessible to non-seminarian peers is not accessible to young priests. They're caught in a bind of stunted sexual growth, and they may be driven emotionally to possess their unexplored sexuality where they left it off, with adolescents or children. And the rules of celibate priesthood had placed sexuality out of bounds, so they pick it up where they left it off in childhood. My own complementary explanation derives from working with 2 active priests, 2 former priests, and several ex-seminarians who quit their studies, partly out of disgust with the sex abuse to which their teachers at the seminary had subjected them. My work demonstrated, sadly, that sex abuse at the seminary can simultaneously initiate young men into homosexual pedophilia and impart the lesson that Catholic institutions tolerate that behavior. Moreover, such abuse can also cause a victim to later appropriate his victimizer's predatory aggressive behavior as a psychological compensation for the shame he felt for being a victim when he was abused at the seminary. Let's take note as we consider these issues that yes, homosexual pedophilia predominates within the church's walls, but also priests have greater access to males than females within Catholicism's sex-segregated communities. There are no altar girls. Priests take boys, not girls, on camping trips and retreats. And yes, solid evidence asks that the generational reproduction of homosexual pedophilia within the church is partly attributable to a role reversal syndrome that plays out among officials, from priests to bishops, who themselves had been child victims of priestly sex abuse. All that, equally, being as it may, equally sordid documentation exists to show that female children are sometimes the victim of sex abuse within the church. In fact, girls are a quarter of priests' victims, and they're disproportionately under 8 years old. The second, and I think more crucial question is, why has it taken this long for this history of a major church's institutional practice of pedophilia to be exposed? And why now? Why has silence about an explosive open secret persisted for thousands of years? And why has it been publicly exposed only within the last 18 years? What's happening in the world that's prompting Catholics to expose their church and criminal behavior of godly, infallible custodians of the faith? For an answer, we should turn to Christianity's last great rupture, the Reformation in the 1500s, which happened as the economic system of feudalism began to crumble. Under feudalism, serfs labored on the estates of lords, giving over to the lord a good portion of what they produced, keeping only the meager amounts they needed to reproduce themselves with their children and to survive. Lords of the manor were entitled to appropriate almost all the fruits of the serfs' labor. Both lords and serfs swore love and fidelity to each other, but only one party, the one in power, could discipline and enforce those bonds and those commitments. Medieval Catholicism justified that arrangement, holding that God had decreed the lord-serf arrangement. Not by coincidence, the feudal model was compatible with the interests of the church itself, which had vast holdings of feudal land with vast numbers of serfs working that land. The Catholic monk Martin Luther counted himself among the many who saw and abhorred the extensive corruption existing within the Catholic Church, particularly enraging to Luther was the sale of what they called indulgences, whereby a sinner could buy a better position in heaven by giving money to the church. Indulgences were kind of the last straw of corruption that inspired Martin Luther to nail his writ of protest and his demands for reform on the door of Wittenberg Cathedral. His example spurred the mobilization of a Protestant movement, which grew in spite of the Pope's excommunication of Luther and his attempt to belittle and suppress his criticisms. The rise of Protestantism was integral with the emergence of a new capitalism, new capitalist formations that would spell the beginning of the end of feudalism. The Protestant Church dismissed the concept that salvation depended on obedience to a Catholic hierarchy, and it disdained the feudal laws of birth on which social position and the near enslavement of serfs was built. Consonant with the needs of ascendant capitalism and its emerging elite, whose status was based on making money and not on birth, an ideology of personal, individual communication with God arose to replace feudalism's more cumbersome, hierarchical, and expensive constructs. Also, Protestant churches swore simplicity and therefore took less money to build elaborate churches with statues and stained glass. Historically, turbulence marks moments of tremendous change, and the period under discussion here is no exception. As capitalism pressed its economic reorganization of the production of goods and services in the larger economy, pressure came to bear on the rigidly patriarchal extended families that still populated the feudal estates. They wouldn't remain there for much longer. As the lords also converted to more profitable forms of production, such as sheep herding, evictions of serfs from the family lands they had farmed for hundreds of years accelerated. They threw them off the lands because they made more profit with wider pastures for sheep. Other serfs, seeing this disruption, ran away and migrated to cities, bourgs, after bourgeois, where the bourgeois capitalists emerged, and the bourgeoisie and capitalism. In the new towns, far from the patriarchs and the church's authority, the customs and the laws of feudalism couldn't hold. Families were falling apart. Pregnant women were left unprotected. Marriage collapsed. Children were abandoned. Faced with various social and economic dislocations, people organized and began to make revolutionary demands that proved quite frightening to the new elites and the old aristocracies and what was left of the church, because they were the only people with the money to be taxed to meet the demands of the people. What happened in France just after the French Revolution illustrates the problem. The most radical and the youngest elements among the rebels, shown in the play by Hugo about the French Revolution, they were demanding that the state pay to bring up children, and children should be reared by the state, including financial support of all children. The new capitalists did not like this. They and the remnants of the feudal aristocracy in the church would have been the one to pay the bill to bring up children. They therefore met to figure out what to do to stop this. To lighten the burden of commoners' devastated lives and to hold at bay the threat of a revolution in personal life for which they would be taxed. Ironically, feudalism, the feudalism of the past, would provide a solution. The French historian Jacques Donzelot documents the invention of the nuclear household and how a feudalism-inspired model for the organization of household labor and family was facilitated and reinforced by the government at the time and by the rich at the time. Donzelot's book is hard to read. The prose is difficult, but it is well worth reading. It's called Policing the Family. In the world of serfdom, the lord of the manor exercised overall control, but the father was the autocratic head on location, the head of his own family. He controlled the lives of his wives and all of his children and his children's families. The eldest son was second in command, heir to the father, or if he were living, the grandfather's rigid patriarchal role. Replication of that model in the world of nascent capitalism elevated the importance of every married man. It conferred upon an ex-serf the role of feudal lord, a wielder of absolute power over his own home, his castle, his wife, and his children. What women got out of this was some protection in pregnancy and child rearing, and a home. In the home of the wage-earning male dictator, children were chattel. One could sell one's children, kill one's children, whatever. They were chattel. The French nation, born out of the 1789 revolution, reinforced nuclear families by giving employment and benefits only to men with dependent wives and children. And that was a time of vast poverty where having a job was crucial. For eligible families, the state and being married spelled survival, but survival at a price. The new nuclear family reinforced the lines of dominance and submission, teaching children and women alike absolute obedience to a male paternal authority, the father. Birth control in the 17 and early 1800s included abandoning or killing the children one didn't want. That was a perfectly legal thing to do. There, in the book, The Kindness of Strangers, there are pictures that were drawn of people, women throwing their kids into the river or otherwise suffocating them. The children who survived learned absolute obedience, as well as a whole lot of other strategies for pleasing their parents. In sum, power elites forged out of the feudal concept of domination, submission, authority, and obedience, the instruments of social control that have served them well to this day when they're breaking down. It served to sustain their power and wealth. Largely ignoring people's cries for help from the state, they shifted onto the nuclear family the cost of raising future generations. Men were disciplined to work until their last breath in order to support their families. Women were disciplined to obey their husbands, maintain homes, and raise future obedient employees. They also were pressured to push their husbands not to strike so that they could live and feed their children. Child-rearing guides developed by the religious right still emphasize absolute obedience on the part of women and children. They affirm women's subordinate position within the church. The books Spare the Child, The Religious Roots of Punishment, and Does the Catholic Church Hate Women, another book, attest to that. It's still going on. Interestingly, at its inception, the U.S. as a nation defined itself as a nation opposed to feudalism. Yet it continued the feudal organization of domestic and emotional labor and sexual labor in the household, as fundamentalist Christianity still does. And so does the Catholic Church. Now, how does this all relate to the contemporary scandals that are rocking the Catholic Church? The, quote, traditional, end quote, family, idealized by the religious right in the Catholic Church, is feudal in its economic organization. Notwithstanding advanced housekeeping aids like vacuum cleaners or whatever, found in most homes now, housework is often still organized along feudal lines. The wife, like the serf, provides use-value goods like cooked food or order, cleanliness, and use-value services like food shopping, laundry, production, child care, low-tech nursing care, management of children's and adult social lives, elder care, and so on. And like the serf, she holds back a portion of what she produces for her own sustenance. She cooks for herself, her husband, and family. She makes the whole bed, her side and her husband's side. And in probably most homes, she cleans everyone's dishes. Her labor was, and is today, not considered work worthy of acknowledgement unless it's performed outside the home or it's poorly paid. That housework is viewed as an aspect of women's biological makeup and God-ordained destiny by the fundamentalist Christian, Orthodox Jewish, and Muslim religions. Not only is a woman doing housework and childcare not regarded as a wage labor, she's not seen as a laborer at all, but rather as a person whose DNA and God-given biology compel her to produce use values consumed in the house. Like her medieval counterpart, she swears love and fidelity to her husband, and he does the same. Until recently, the terms of this oath of love and fidelity were subject to enforcement by the husband without recourse. But even though ongoing struggles for women's rights have won passage of laws against abuse in the home, domestic violence is still a leading cause of death for women aged 15 to 44. Women are most often killed after leaving a relationship with a spouse or lover who felt entitled to enforce his terms on her departure. It was a feudal right, if you will. Children have also recently been accorded some rights. owing again to feminist activism. However, murdered children are still overwhelmingly the victims of their own families in their own homes. 85% of child homicides are perpetrated by relatives and parents in the home. Certain prevalent circumstances of the past rationalized household feudalism. Those conditions were a family wage for white men. They were also unreliable birth control methods, unavailable legal abortion, and the widespread belief in biologically determined sex roles. Let's consider those factors. The family wage which was paid to North American white men between 1820 and 1970 enabled those men to support a wife whose full-time job was cleaning, cooking, providing emotional and sexual services to the male head of household and that man's children. She also provided the social service of connecting him to his family. An ideological rationale for that arrangement was the belief that biology is destiny by God's decree. Women must work at home, providing use-value services to husbands and children. Women in such feudal households are subordinate to the higher authority of the male in chief. However, this patriarchal feudal family structure, so enthusiastically celebrated by the Catholic Church, is now eroding. In large part because men's real wages, i.e., what they could actually buy, have been flat since the 1970s. Women now have to labor outside the home for the survival of their families. Birth control is now widely available. Abortion, although unavailable in 90 U.S. counties, is accessible nonetheless. Thank you for listening. This episode has been brought to you by Democracy at Work. Please support our work. Visit our website at democracyatwork.info. Help us help you so we can help together to make a better America.